Hi, it's Searching for Answers again, the program in which we dig into the text to find out all we can about what it meant and what it still means in our lives today. So we're into the Epistle to the Hebrews, right in the middle of that fascinating book. So many questions are arising. So while you get your Bible or Bibles, whatever versions and translations work for you, we'll get ourselves introduced here and get right underway. We're particularly happy this evening that Dr. Bernard Taylor, Old Testament scholar who knows a whole lot about the New Testament and its language as well, is with us. Starting at the other end, Dr. Leo Rancelin, New Testament scholar, and on the faculty here of religion at Loma Linda University. Dr. William Johnson, known to so many of us as editor of the Adventist Review, and we're especially pleased to welcome a new guest this evening, Dr. Eric Webster. Pastor Webster has been a pastor in the South Africa Union for a long time and editor of the South Africa edition of Signs of the Times, as I remember.
Right, that's right.
How many years
did I do the Signs? 22 years. That was after my retirement.
Yeah, that was after retirement. Dr. Webster has just had his 90th birthday. Wow. And he's a long-distance runner besides, so we're impressed. They're just tickled that Dr. Webster is here in the country, able to guest with us here on our panel on this occasion. So we'll roll up our sleeves and dig right in.
Thank you.
Bill, tell us a little bit about the major chunk that we're looking at here in the Epistle to the Hebrews. What are we really dealing with in chapters 8, 9, and going on into chapter 10?
Yeah, here? From 8:1 through 10:18, the writer is dealing with Jesus, not just as high priest, but as the sacrifice for sins. And as in the earlier parts of the book, the key idea is better. Yeah. He's better than angels, better than Moses, and so on. So he's the better high priest, and his sacrifice is better than animal sacrifices. In two respects, he emphasizes this point. Number one, the sacrifice of Jesus provides unhindered access to the presence of God. The door to heaven is open because of Jesus' sacrifice. That's one point. The other one is that this is a sacrifice that deals with the age-old problem of human sin. We've all messed up, but God has provided the way out, the sacrifice of Jesus.
So the point is that it's really efficacious. It really works.
Absolutely.
And that's somehow a new assurance, isn't it, along the way?
In contrast to all those animal sacrifices, year after year, thousands upon thousands.
Wonderful.
Yeah, so Bernard, take us through that final paragraph, if you would, in chapter 9, verses 28 down to the end, and let's see if we can get into this.
23 down to the end?
23, I misspoke. I meant 3.
Hebrews 9, 23 through the end of the chapter.
Yeah.
And because of the abrupt beginning of verse 23, I want to just read verse 22, which is the end of a paragraph which has introduced blood and the importance of it. And verse 22, indeed, under the law, almost everything is purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. Thus, it was necessary for the sketches of the heavenly things to be purified with these rites, but the heavenly things themselves need better sacrifices than these. For Christ did not enter a sanctuary made by human hands, a mere copy of the true one, but he entered into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf. Nor was it to offer himself again and again, as the high priest enters the holy place year after year with blood that is not his own. for then he would have had to suffer again and again since the foundation of the world. But as it is, he has appeared once for all at the end of the age to remove sin by the sacrifice of himself. And just as it is appointed for mortals to die once, and after that the judgment, so Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time, not to deal with sin, but to save those who are eagerly waiting for him.
So there are parallels, but there are differences.
Yes.
And this knife cuts both ways, kind of, doesn't it? Tell us a little more about that. What jumps out for you from this passage that you've read?
The clear distinction that the earthly is a copy of the heavenly.
Yeah.
And while there will be similarities between the earthly and the heavenly does not take precedence over the heavenly. And so simply because there were certain things that were done, that doesn't mean that there's a corresponding heavenly part. And it's too easy to allegorize here and put another layer, a meta layer on top of the text here.
Yeah.
And so that really jumps out at me. And the other is, just to do it in one word with the Greek, hapax.
Once. Yeah.
And I like the idea that Christ is in the presence of God, right at his right hand. And I think in the earthly system there was a distance. The high priest could only go in once. But here we have Christ in the presence of God. That should give us comfort and assurance that there's no separation between Christ and the Father.
Right, and it's a kind of an enduring presence. There's no more in and out.
Right.
Right? It's constant, right?
That gives one assurance, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And John, on this, we don't need anyone else, any intermediary. Okay?
We don't need
a human priest. We don't need a saint, whoever, because we go directly to Jesus.
Direct access.
Direct access. It is such a wonderful idea.
Yeah.
It is.
So, Leo, when you look at this, what do you see? What's the mental picture in your mind when you look at this?
What I've tried to do is understand the structure of the argument that Dr. Johnson alluded to earlier from chapter 7 through 10, because I think this is the heart, of the homily, of what he really wants to get across. And I'm just amazed how he comes to these themes again and again, and each time adds a different layer to that theme as he approaches that. So I was struck by the prologue, when he had made purification for sins. And so in some sense, that clause is unpacked in chapter 7 through 10 in a profound way, where I think, as you noted, his eternal priesthood, Melchizedekian, and his eternal sacrifice are unpacked in full and rich ways. And so what I've done is, on one side, I made a chart. Here's the Old Covenant, the earthly sanctuary, the priests, and the sacrifices, and compare and contrast to the New Covenant, the heavenly sanctuary, and the Melchizedekian priesthood of Christ, and the once and for all sacrifice. And I think when you do that, you begin to appreciate the glory of what you've been talking about here, because as we all know, in the Old Covenant, the Levitical sacrificial system had a massive problem with sin. And it could not overcome the sin problem. The blood of bulls and goats cannot overcome the problem of sin. It cannot bring about perfection. It cannot cleanse the conscience of the worshiper so that the worshiper can enter into a richer and deeper, intimate relationship with God.
That's right.
All of a sudden now, here comes the eternal priesthood of Christ and his once and for all, unblemished, perfect sacrifice, and that overcomes that dilemma of entering into the presence of God, which was so limited under the Levitical sacrificial system. So when you compare and contrast the two, I'm just amazed at to what he truly says theologically Jesus has achieved in Jesus. It's just remarkable.
Yeah. So the contrast is both temporal on a line, old and new, but we've got this going on, don't we, at the same time? And the earthly is a shadow, kind of an impression, if we use the technical Greek term there, of what's above, right? So so there is indeed a qualitative difference that really wants to say, ultimately, it comes home to our conscience. 9:9. That is new. People, I think, were plagued by this. It haunted them. You've said it well, Leo, so I don't need to repeat it. But that constant haunting, gnawing, did it work? Was it effective? Did it really do what it's supposed to do?
Right.
Oh, and by the way, that was a month ago, and here I've got guilt on my hands again. And all of that kind of psychological struggle, which we just don't encounter that in the Old Testament. In the same sense, something is happening to the human race. I think in the Mediterranean world of that day, something new is emerging. The historians call it the age of anxiety, and for good reason, you know. So, but it wasn't only then, it still applies to us today, doesn't it?
Don't you like the idea in verse 26 that he has appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself? So in a sense, sin has been dealt with. We should not be troubled all the time by a sinful past, which we probably all have, or by mistakes that we make. He has put away sin. Christ has dealt with sin there. And so we look to the cross, we look to his death, and we look to his life as giving us salvation and giving us eternal life. Is that right?
Yes, and
sin has been wounded.
Yes, and because of the definitiveness of what Christ has done, when he speaks in 9:28 of the second appearance, he has to say, now that's not for dealing with sin, you know. That has been definitively done. It's to deal with us now, in a way, isn't it? Right.
As we draw near to the end of this chapter, it really impresses me that first that he took the time to go in such detail, which was affirming where presumably his readers were and they attempted to go back to. There is much that is attractive. It has what was so helpful before is now not wrong. It's just not right because it has been superseded. But it's so affirming. He affirms everything that he can along the way, but says there are differences. In effect, it's a copy, but it's not and can't be an exact copy. Like you said with the temporal, for a particular time and particular place, it functioned well. But now what we have is so much better. And though we will come across persecution shortly as we go along, and there have been consequences for them, you can't turn aside from it. You can't go back. And here, with this glorious climax in the passage that I read about how much better Jesus is, and that repetition, which had its own attraction in a way. You knew the rituals, same time, same of the year, same things, and all of that can be comforting. But that in it will also keep you from seeing where that in itself was intended to lead. And that is where he wants them to go and to see. And I think that a key reason why he went back and reiterated all that they know, but now taking it beyond. It's like Chronicles compared to Kings. The King's end at the Babylonian captivity, Chronicles only has a little bit more, but now goes into the Persian period and return. And this goes beyond where they have, where they are thinking to see what they would be turning aside from.
John,
Yes.
a thought. If we did not have the book of Hebrews,
Yeah.
now, here we see tied together the old and the new. You know, all those, the book of Leviticus in particular, and the other books there of Moses, they deal a lot with sacrifice, but there's really no explanation. It's simply do this.
Yeah.
Okay? This is the ritual. But here we see the meaning of it and the going beyond, the glory of what Jesus has done in himself, priest and sacrifice.
Yeah, that's true. True.
Leo, as you look at the doubleness of this, the old and the new, and the earthly and the heavenly, how it's hard for us. We are not given, for one thing, we don't care much about history. But we also are not given today to thinking naturally about this world and the overworld, you know, the above, the celestial. We seem, it's so easy for us to forget the idea of marching to the beat of a different drum somehow, isn't it? So we lose that polarity between earth and heaven. We're pretty earthly minded, aren't we? As you look at all of this in 2017, what can modern, postmodern human beings do with this? Where do we
the question
go?
for me. I've wrestled with it the last couple of weeks, John, because it's taken me a great deal of effort to understand with some precision the homily and its argument.
Yeah.
And the Old Covenant and New Covenant that get contrasted, as I alluded to earlier.
Yeah.
And I do want to underscore the point that when you put everything down with the Old Covenant, I know some comments have been said here, the author is pretty clear. The Old Covenant, the first, had a fault. It had a fault. That's exactly what he says, finding fault with it. It had human beings who were morally flawed, who had to offer sacrifices for themselves, right?
Yeah.
And that sacrificial system, he's clear again and again, cannot perfect the worshiper and cannot grant access and is inadequate in profound ways. And so I've alluded to this earlier. Lord, why would you establish the Israelite sacrificial system that was so inadequate, so ineffective for the people of God? Perhaps to foreshadow and prepare for what Christ did, yes, but boy, you sure wish more could have been accomplished and achieved. Now, to get back to your question, once you really grasp its argument, you have to sit back and say, in what way is this relevant to postmoderns, given how deeply encased it is within its social historical setting? I'm absolutely convinced that the Jewish Christians who are thinking of going back, and he wants to say, please don't, Christ is magnificent, as you've said. I think for me, the takeaway is, wow, appreciate the depth and breadth of the theology that gets sketched here, that you really see in a nutshell in the prologue there. The prologue is so phenomenal, right? He is the radiance of God's glory, the exact imprint of God, the definitive revelation of God. And that gets unpacked in this homily. So I want to appreciate that more fully so that I can have, and we're going to get to this in chapter 11, right, the kind of persevering faith.
Sure.
The persevering faith that I will need in the midst of my hardships, afflictions, and difficulties, and to follow the forerunner who's got the whale. So I want to have that kind of perseverance. So that's the takeaway for me. You know.
So 11, the faith chapter, which is what most people think of when they think of it, really is anchored in this long argument, this presentation, right? Before we move on to chapter 10, anybody else, anything else that we need to pick up on here in this last paragraph of chapter 9? Have we gotten the kernel of it here?
Yeah, you know, this writing, in the main, looks back. It looks back to the cross.
Yes.
But it does not deny the second coming, however. And here's the first clear. Well, earlier, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God, waiting. There's a time coming So it's looking forward. And here again, there's an allusion to the second coming.
Yes.
Okay. But he's going to come again, and this time it will not be to deal with the sin problem. That's been dealt with, okay?
Definitively.
Definitively, yeah. So it's interesting to see the way in which he makes room for that and reminds his readers of that. And there'll be a couple of other places that will come up shortly.
Okay. Yeah.
If I could just add to that, Joe, you've alluded to the vertical dimension and, and the horizontal. And here what we have is the already and the not yet.
That's right.
The eschatological framework, that's
Right.
part of this letter.
That's right.
As they eagerly await him for salvation. And then, as we're going to see here in chapter 10, as they see that the day is drawing near.
That's right.
So he's a good Adventist in some sense. He wants them to live this persevering faith in light of, in his eyes, the soon coming of Jesus Christ.
So something's resolved once and for all, but there's still tensions.
Right.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting?
Salvation has not been fully achieved.
Yeah.
I got to say this. They eagerly await the day. They're not fear and trembling as they look for the day. Eagerly awaiting.
Yeah.
The
And
glad
we
day,
should
the
not be
blessed hope.
we should not be discouraged about the certainty of the coming of Christ, even though it might be a wait of 2,000 years. We might be discouraged sometimes by the length of the time, but God says, with me, a day is, 1,000 years like a day, and so on. So we're dealing with God's time. Must we therefore be patient and trust, believe that it will end victoriously?
Livingston used to say, he's a gentleman who keeps his word.
Yeah.
So Jesus keeps his word. He promised he's going to come. He will come.
At a time when we might not even expect it.
In his time, he will
But
come.
if we're awake, we'll know and look forward to it, won't we?
And so a question that I've been wrestling with is the depth and richness of the Christology of this homily. Perhaps there's no other document in the New Testament that is as rich as this, because as we have seen in the early parts of the homily, he underscores the incarnation. He learned obedience, right, through suffering. Profound motifs about his humanity, and yet the Christology here is lofty and elevated as he sits at the right hand of the Father, enthroned, having achieved and accomplished the redemptive work that God wants for him. So is there any other document in the NT that is as rich theologically with respect to the person and work of Christ? Wow. I'm not sure.
I can't name one.
Yeah, it's just a remarkable document.
The richest pictures that tease us into new thought are pictures that have a built-in paradox of some kind or some kind of a tension in them. Isn't it so?
Yeah.
That our minds keep coming back to chew on things that have a kind of polarity about them that's not readily resolved. And I think that's what we've got going here. Somebody, we only have a few minutes left, but who would like to pick up on chapter 10 and maybe take us down through the first 10 verses? Who would like to do that?
Bill.
Well, Leo, you pick up the ball.
Well, how about it? The first part is
and we'll join you.
1 through 4, right?
Yeah.
So here he says, for the law has a shadow of the good things to come, not the very form of things. Because it is not able, by the same sacrifices which are offered continually every year, and notice again what I've said earlier, how he underscores the inadequacy of worship and sacrifice under the Old Covenant. They cannot what? Make perfect those who draw near, seeking to draw near to God. It just cannot achieve and accomplish that. Then he asks this rhetorical question, otherwise would they not have ceased? Because the worshipers, having been cleansed once, would no longer have any, the sense here is consciousness of sins, a sense of guilt for sin. Verse 3, but by these sacrifices there is a reminder of sins every year. And then quite strongly, unequivocally, for it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins.
Yeah.
Again, the inadequacy of worship and sacrifice with the Levitical sacrificial system gets underscored again. And I think you really need to understand that to fully appreciate the redemptive work of Christ. Want me to continue or pause
Sure,
there?
yeah,
Or maybe that's a kind of a thought on itself, isn't it, that one?
yeah.
Or you think one should go on? I just raised the question, did God actually forgive people in the Old Testament without the blood? Well, there surely was forgiveness, wasn't there?
There's
The Old
forgiveness, yeah.
I think the issue that the issue is, when we read the Old Testament, is the issue not of the Godward side, because we've reminded ourselves already there is never any explanation. The rationale is not spelled out. Rather, the issue is from the human side. How do we feel? Is this satisfactory?
Yeah.
Are we gratified by it? So the objective question of divine forgiveness is one that floats above our human consciousness in the Old Testament without ever fully resolving. So I think it's right to ask the question, but we can simply answer it by saying we can only assume that God forgave.
I mean, we find it with David, don't we? He was forgiven, wasn't he?
Yeah.
And he's
God-
used as an example of righteousness by faith in
God
Romans.
instituted the whole sacrificial system. It came from God. You know?
I think God forgave first and then gave himself and his son, didn't he?
Yeah, I think so, yes.
Forgiveness in light of the coming
Yeah,
redemptive work of Christ.
Yeah.
yeah. The way I understand it is that salvation, you know, it's, Jesus is the Savior of the world. Okay. The Gospel
God
of
so
John.
loved it. He loved and then he gave his son,
Yeah,
didn't he?
yeah. So all salvation,
But maybe these sacrifices could not forgive. But God's heart of love can forgive
yes.
in anticipation of him coming himself and giving himself.
By going through this ritual, you showed your faith in God. He said, do this, and you did it, if you really had faith in God, okay? I know from one point of view it seems sort of gross, you know, all this shedding of blood, but yet it was God's way for them, and it was pointing forward to
To
the
make an
reality.
impression upon them, eh?
Yeah.
I suppose the next few verses show that these sacrifices were inadequate,
Oh, yeah.
if we read them on.
Yeah. They showed that sin is not a light matter.
No.
Yeah.
Right.
Sin involved really heavy stuff,
Yep.
not easily dealt with.
We've reminded ourselves this evening that it's the Epistle to the Hebrews that really brings out clearly that God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And we can only draw from that the assumption, the conclusion, that the economy of salvation was one. The system worked on both sides of the divide between Old and New Testament. But from the human side, we still struggle, don't we, with the connection and the distinction. We'll pick up on this next time, then, as we gather together again, inviting you to join us on Searching for Answers.